You can help support the channel by heading to our merchandise store and picking up some of our great aircraft designs created by our graphic designer. We have everything from fighters to transport aircraft, which you can choose to have printed on t-shirts, mugs, stickers and much more. Head to the description below and click the links and pick up your design today. Thank you and enjoy. So we're back with Mike Crain, who was a former Aussie F111 pilot, and I think you've got some great stories to share with our viewers, haven't you?
Hi, Mike. Yeah, it's great to be back again, and hope I am able to come up with a couple for you that are interesting and keep everybody entertained. So Mike suggested that we talk about day in the life of an F111 pilot, what you do. So we'll start with, most days we started work at 8 o'clock in the morning brief. It's pretty common throughout the RAAF. We are a government organisation, so when we're not on exercise, we're pretty much an 8 till 5 and 3 o'clock on Fridays when we finish. But morning brief, we started with a hack, and if you weren't there, you were in trouble. And the other thing is, as mobile phones came in, made sure they were on silent as well. We went through morning brief, the whole squadron was there, and went weather, air traffic control, just talking about various squadron things, and then everybody went off to go and do their own thing. Now, we weren't flying every day in the F111. Our sorties were about 2.5 to 3 hours long. We ran quite a few targets, and we might go and do fly up the Gold Coast, up the beach, followed by an ILS in Brisbane, etc. So they were pretty busy, and they required quite a lot of planning, as you can imagine, doing air to ground. It's not off the cuff generally. So we'd plan perhaps the day before the flight, or if we're flying in the afternoon, we might do in the morning, and that took most of our efforts for perhaps half a day just to get everything ready to go for the sortie. We then, after the mission planning, we'd go and get together in a formation brief, or if we were doing singleton exercises, so a stream maybe 5-10 minutes apart, we would still brief together, but they weren't as a formation. But a lot of the time it was about 50-50 whether we were doing formation or single ship, whether day or night. The brief went for perhaps about an hour, and then we stepped to the aircraft, and that was about an hour before takeoff time. So out to the maintenance, sign for the jets, look at all the snags. We kept pretty good records of what was going on with the aircraft, how the TFRs were functioning, and weapons performance. So we logged all our practice bombs, and hopefully they were able to, in the old pre-avionics update aircraft, they were able to adjust certain settings in the weapons computer, even though it was an analog system, so hopefully get better performance. After checking that, out to the aircraft, standard sort of pre-flight for everybody, pilots checking their side and navs theirs, and we both did a walk around, taking all the covers and pins off, etc. Then jumped in the jet, and about half an hour before takeoff started it up, and that gave us a bit of time in case there was any problems with any of the avionics. We could do some replaceable, there were some LRUs, line replaceable units, and the technicians could open up the various panels in the nose, etc., and change things out if they needed. There wasn't, as many of you know, in the airline industry, you operate under the minimum equipment list. We didn't have that. It was purely up to the crew's judgment on whether you could go or not. Obviously, engines, airframe had to be working, but a lot of other things we just say, well, we think we can do the mission without that and continue on. So reliability was pretty good, and when we got to the aircraft, it was pretty rare to have a ground abort. Once that was all done, check in on the common frequency. Later on, we were running HavQuick, which was good. We could just plug that into the GPS and we could talk, and no one else was listening to us amongst our common frequency. head out to the runway and get ready for takeoff. The aircraft's pretty standard, I guess, military type departures. You just taxi out, do your checks, make sure the pins are out, run the engines up, light the afterburners on the brakes, and then once they were both engaged, then you release the brakes and take off. The F-111 being fairly heavy wasn't a super acceleration on the runway with a full tank of fuel. We weighed about 81,000 pounds with no weapons or just some practice bombs. If we, I think the heaviest I ever took off was with 16 Mark 82s. So 2 racks with 6 on each, and they were inerts. And then we had 4 high explosive ones, 2 on each side. Wow. So we had 4 racks, and that took us up to about 95,000 pounds for takeoff. And there was a lot of drag with that. So you did feel the difference in how long the takeoff roll, as well as the higher takeoff speeds. But that wasn't very common to take that many. You see some shots like behind me there with perhaps 6 Mark 82s on each side. But most of the time we were practicing with precision guided, so GBU 10s and 12s, and you can only take 4 of them. So even with 2,000 pounders, though they're pretty heavy, and did quite a few flights with them with 4. That's an 8,000 pound weapon load. The drag was not much, so it was very different from carrying a whole stack of Mark 82s. We'd take off, climb up to a medium altitude, do all our weapons checks. We'd run TFR checks. We'd check them up above 5,000 feet where the radar kicked in, make sure they were functioning correctly. And then we'd let down. And we generally do a terrain following radar let down, which once we engaged the automatic pilot, it would just pitch down to about 10 degrees nose down. We'd be going down about 8,000 feet a minute. And then when the radar locked on at 5,000 feet, it would pitch down another 2 degrees and go to about 10,000 feet a minute. Depending whether you're over the ground or water, it would pull up at about 3,000 feet start, and we'd level off at 1,000. But over the water, if it was a smooth sea, it would go down to 1,700 feet and it would pull pretty firmly and level off at 1,000. The reason we did 1,000 feet rather than straight down to our normal training altitude of 400 was just to give us a little bit of time in case something went wrong. And there'd been some accidents before where they had very little time to react, and they thought that was a factor in the investigation. So by the time I got there, we would always descend to 1,000 feet initially and then descend down to 400 feet as a standard. Some exercises, we'd take it all the way down to 200 feet, and doing some test flights, etc. I did later on. We'd do 200 feet hard ride and check all the systems working properly, and it was pretty spectacular. Going through the hills, pulling about 3 to 4 G to go over the top, it would push over and the radar would read 200 feet at the peak of the crest, and 0 G as you went over.
Ooh, yeah.
It was hard ride was reasonably firm. Now, daytime not normally a problem, and 400 feet daytime was actually pretty boring after a while.
Oh, really?
Once you got used to it. So, yeah, I much preferred to hand fly. So anytime I could see outside, TFRs were off and we were down to 250 feet and just hand flying. And that way we could roll around over the hills inverted, keep the altitude down. It was a lot more fun. The TFRs have a limit. They could only see into the turn at 2 degrees a second. So the bank angle was supposed to be 30 degrees, but at about 40 degrees you get a caution light telling you to roll out.
Right.
So during the daytime, it was much more fun to hand fly, and you're down 250 feet. Now, standard cruising speed was 480 knots, and we generally run our targets at 540. But that would depend on exercises. When we go into the big exercises, we'd be running at about whatever the weapons limit was, so 600 knots, I think, for about, Mark 82s to about 600. They were 0.9. 84s or GBU-10s, you could go supersonic. After release, we would go as fast as we could, which would generally be 0.96, 0.97, and sometimes you might see the tapes jumping and settle on the other side of Mach 1. It's motoring along, and the fuel flows are pretty intense too. Just to give you viewers an idea, we could cruise around it for about 2.5 hours at 480 knots. So with the fuel flow was about 12,000 pounds an hour, and we started off with 33,000. On the G model, we even had 35,000 pounds, which was there was 2,000 pounds in the weapons bay tank. So it was pretty long range. But when you go supersonic, full afterburner, the fuel flow was about 2,000 pounds a minute. So you could run the tanks dry in 15 minutes, even with that amount of. And that's about 3 times as much as a Hornet has internally.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. And one thing I want to ask you, Mike, before you went for a flight, did you check the wing sweep, like everything was working okay, or how did that work?
We did all the flight controls. I don't think we always checked the wing sweep that they could move backwards. We may have done just to 16 to 26. So we normally take off at the 16 wing and back to 26. But I can't recall the wing sweep ever having a problem. And, there's some places like in Malaysia, we used to park with the wings fully back because there wasn't enough room. We were in the revetments, quite narrow. They were built for, I think, Mirages initially. So we had the wing sweep all the way back, and it was pretty tight taxiing in there with the walls around you. So, and we'd leave I think when we were parked, we'd then sweep them forward so that the ground crew could check that everything was still working, but taxiing definitely had them all the way back. So that reduced our wing sweep from around 70 feet to a 30 odd, about the same as a 172. As we all know, Mike loves to hear about DACT, so I've got a couple of stories there in case you're interested in the F,
yes,
being the fighter part of the F-111. I know that some of you will probably shake your heads, but one thing we always did in the RAAF, I think similarly in the RAF, was we did a lot of common training with, so regardless of whether you went to in our case, F-18s or F-111s, we all did an introductory fighter course where you learnt basic fighter manoeuvres as well as air to ground before going on to our operational types. So everybody wants to be a fighter pilot. And the first chance I ever got, believe it or not, was against the F3. It was in Malaysia. And my nav and I think we may have been the youngest crew in the world at the time. We were both 21. We flew from Butterworth across to the east coast of Malaysia, and British Aerospace at the time were trying to sell the Tornadoes, both the air-to-ground GR4 and the F3, to the Malaysian Air Force. And so they were over there as well. As we were ingressing towards Singapore at about 15,000 feet, it was all a setup, but these F3s, we didn't perhaps see them till quite late, but one of them came sailing across from the right, as it turns out, so the nav side, and Deethy called him to me, and when I picked him up visually, I just pitched into him, and we just ended up in a classic flat scissors for 3 or 4 turns. I must say that we stayed pretty much neutral. I mean, had the wings fully forward. I think probably he did as well. I was in full afterburner, and perhaps he was playing with us a little bit, but we were pretty much on the stall warning and the light buffet. And it seemed to me we stayed pretty neutral. And after about three or four turns, decided I'm probably not authorised to be doing DACT. So I think I gave him a wing waggle and we called it off at that point and pressed on. But I must say, they were the pretty experienced guys in the flying the F3, and we were pretty brand new in the aircraft with about, I think, maybe 90, 100 hours maximum at that point.
Wow.
So that was a lot of fun.
And did you have a debrief at the end? Or like, did you call the F3 guys and have a chat, or was it that's it?
I don't think so. It was very much separate. Those IADS exercises in Malaysia were pretty canned. You had to be within about 2 minutes of all your turn points, and that meant that they could send the fighters out to meet you. It was a training of the whole system itself. So it wasn't really what we do, in real life. So in this case, we were doing what was called a probe into Singapore, and they were probably getting vectors from ground control to us. The other time, I ended up in a bit of a furball over Malaysia was with a couple of Malaysian Hawks, and it was a similar sort of scenario. We were come across the mountains there back towards south of Butterworth, aiming towards Ipoh, and we picked up visually on my side this time. I picked up a pair of Hawks. We were about 10,000 feet, and I was in a G model, which is great because it had a bit more thrust, a couple of thousand pounds per engine. So as soon as I saw them, again, pitched into them, probably about 5G, but had a service limit of 4. But as long as you didn't pull 5.5 and clicked over that fatigue meter, you generally wouldn't get in trouble at the end. But I was on the buffer, managed about 720 degrees with them in turns, so 2 full turns, but they were gaining angles generally just as we progressed. And at that point, I realised it's time to give up, and I was heading back west again, unloaded to 0G with full afterburner, and we accelerated from 350 knots, and I did see us going supersonic just before we entered the cloud, and I turned the TFRs on again. Went into the cloud, over some mountaintops, and disappeared. And I think we ran away from them pretty quickly in that one. But that was a lot of fun. It was 2v1, 2 Hawks versus. And so for your mates back in England, that's pretty much was the RAAF contingent at the time, fighting F-111 Hawks and Tornadoes. Another story I had from Malaysia was a bit more of a scary one, but I was leading a 2-ship down towards Singapore again, and we were low level in target, and we saw some A4s in the distance. Turned towards them. Initially, I hadn't worked out they were A4s, but as soon as they started turning, I did, and they called break turn on us, and we were on the same side. So I was on the common frequency, trying to tell them that we're turning away and we were no threat to them. I don't think they were listening though. So I'd made probably an error in the fact that I started turning right, and and I'd gone belly up to them, so I couldn't see them anymore. And the next thing I see is this A4 just went through the nose about 200 feet in front of us, and we're travelling at about 1,000 feet a second, so we're pretty close. I could just about see the guy's name on his helmet, and just went through 90 degrees. So the nav saw it as well, and we had a reunion recently, and he reminded me of that incident. And it took probably about 10 minutes to get the heart rate down. So I got my wingman to join up into just a combat position, which is sort of long line astern there, where he can do what he wants back behind me. And we flew around Singapore, got back into a normal heart rate, and then pressed on and back into the rest of the mission, which went for about another hour or so as we headed up the South China Sea, and then ran a couple more targets in Malaysia before getting back to Butterworth. But when you're young, you're resilient and you can get over those things fairly quickly.
Yeah, of course. I mean, amazing. But yeah, like when you were like obviously that young and you were flying, us going to Singapore. How do you feel? Like that must have been amazing. Like what? This is crazy.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, one of the other missions I did on the first time I was there, I was with my flight commander, so he was a pretty experienced guy, I mean, as squadron leader at the time, and here I am, Pilot Officer Crain in the left seat as the captain. But we ran down, I can't remember the name of the river, but it's basically down the ILS for runway 20 into Changi Airport on the river, and ran the army barracks just on it was the Tekong Army Barracks was our target, and we were simulating dropping Mark 82 Snake Eyes there. And after we simulated released on the target, we're just to the east of Changi. And we were lit up by a Rapier surface-to-air missile system. And the boss was calling me, Mickey, get down. And we went, I remember seeing 0.98, the tapes jumping, and 90 feet on the Radalt as I went around the smallest. It was a pretty small hill, but I was trying to get as low as I could. And it's good being with the authorising officer because he didn't mind one little bit.
That's amazing.
Okay.
I mean, it's incredible. Like, and in terms of like working with other nations as well, like, how did you feel? Like, did you like? I mean, obviously you said Singapore there. Would you be in contact with their Air Force, Army, and stuff like that, or was it again like you just went back to base and you did your own thing?
Yeah, it wasn't a red flag type debrief, or even the ones we ran in Australia, pitch black, the FCI course when they were completing their training. We had big exercises with them, and they were all common briefs and a big debrief at the end. The Malaysian exercises were not. We just really had a formation debrief, and we would maybe try and get in touch with the other players, but they were spread out in Malaysia and Singapore. There was the Navy involved as well, and they were offshore, and we'd really didn't get a chance to talk to them too much. But they were, so that was a little bit different. It was just a lot of fun. So I went there 4 times, and Malaysia was, really had a great time there. The flying was fun. We'd come back and we'd run airfield attacks, and especially the last one when I was flying the G model, and we were all fairly experienced then. We'd run some pretty interesting attack profiles on the ground crew. They were back at the base until I think it was the Air Vice Marshal, the commander of all the air combat group in the Royal Australian Air Force. He happened to come for a visit, and he saw us, and then he said, "No more unrealistic attack profiles, thank you very much." But because we're doing 10-degree dives down to about 500 feet in a 10-degree dive in a combat pair.
Yeah. And
hitting about 0.9 to 0.95, and then pulling up to about 60 degrees nose up straight afterwards, and then heading out to Penang and doing a lap around the island was generally how we finished those missions.
You lucky bugger. There's one question I want to ask. Like, I guess like everyone's seen the famous like beach passes, like with the Nephilim 11 going down. Did you ever do that?
Yeah, I did pretty regular runs along the beach. So our bombing range at Evans Head was south of the Gold Coast, and if maybe once a month we'd try and save enough fuel to do a low-level run up past Byron Bay and up the Gold Coast. And over water, our standard authorisation was 100 feet, so we do that. basically a wingtip in the sand if we could. Some of the ones on the videos you've probably seen, they were generally for IndyCar running up the coast, and the guys were pretty close to the beach on that one. Perhaps we were a little bit, but further, but not much until maybe in the mid-90s. They started. A lot of people started flying these really big kites. The movie world had opened up, and there were things like Superman and Wonder Woman, huge kites being flown off the beach. So we had to steer clear of them because you couldn't see the lines, you could just see the kites, and we were lower than them generally. Another time I was at night time, we could fly at 300 feet over water, just hand fly it, and do that as well up the Gold Coast. So it was some pretty good views. I did do one. I did an instrument rating once with the boss, and he got me to go and do a circuit at Coolangatta. And at the end of that, he took over on base, and he had a mate in the tower that night for some reason, somehow, and he made a fairly spectacular departure as we went past the tower in full afterburner at about 100 feet at night. After taking over from. But yeah, that was all on the Gold Coast. Now, one thing about that, we sometimes got noise complaints from around Brisbane. I tell you what, we never got any in Malaysia.
Really? Because it's like so fast.
No one ever complained in Malaysia, but sometimes someone would have a complaint, and we try and steer clear of them. And that was generally in Australia. I think you have the same problems in the UK.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like, I guess like the beach fly pass and like flying over there. Did you ever like just wings back and full burner just to like give the crowd a bit? The crowd, the people on the beach. Did you ever do that?
Yeah, I might have done that once or twice there, Mike. Just,
not confirmed at all.
The timing. Oh, might have once or twice, and it does work well at night.
Yeah. Especially
if you pop the speed brake for a little while and lets you have a little bit more time in afterburner.
Yeah. Absolutely amazing sight.
You're at the level of the building, so there's some pretty good views there. I mean, the other one we tried to do was up north on Fraser Island, so we'd generally fly up there. That was a really good beach run. And I remember one time went right to the northern tip. We were heading north and we're 100 feet, and there was a guy, and he had his four-wheel drive there at the end of the beach, and he was looking due north, and we came up behind him at about 550 knots, 100 feet. I would have loved seeing his expression in the rearview mirror, but...
So while we wrap up this interview, Mike, have you got maybe one more story that we can just hear for our viewers, and like something that stands out really in your mind?
Well, keeping on the air-to-air phase, I must have a little one. We were doing the FCI course in the Blue Mountains, just to the west of Richmond Air Force Base near Sydney. They were out of Williamtown, we were out of Amberley. We had these exercises for about a week or so, and they were a really good mix-up against the F-18s. Sometimes we'd have them on our side as an escort, but a lot of the time it was just them out there trying to find us. And on one occasion, I was running in low through the Blue Mountains, and if you know the canyons, they're quite deep and straight, and it was spectacular countryside. But I saw this Hornet up in the distance. Put my nose on him. We were down at 250 feet, and I guess he was probably about, I don't know, maybe 1,000 feet. It was above the horizon, so I had a pretty good look up at him. And we had our AIM-9 on board, so I was able to lock him up and get a tone and simulate a release. And then I thought, you know what, I've been itching to do this forever. And that was, on our site, there was a guns air-to-air mode, so I selected that and tracked him pip right, and we went about 180 degrees out at 550 knots, and I was started at about 250 feet. He was probably slightly above, and then I realised that when he got pretty close, I thought I'd been, got to get my nose off. I was trying to remember all my the limits we had back when I was doing my fighter course. But it was a good track. I don't know whether it would have worked or not, but it was pretty spectacular going head to head low level with over 1,000 knots closure.
Wow.
So
that's impressive.
That's one thing that stands in my mind. Unfortunately, we don't have a gun camera, so I could never prove it. But you'll just have to trust me on it. I did try, and I did select the guns mode, even though the gun by that time had gone out of our jets in favour of PaveTac. So
brilliant stuff. One question I want to ask you, Mike, before we wrap up this chat here. If you had the chance to fly in a Tornado GR1 or an F-14, what would you go for?
Well, Mike, I'm going to have to say the F-14. It's I just love to compare it. The GR1 would have been look, I had plenty of friends who flew it, and I got to work later in life with a lot of ex-Tornado drivers, but it was pretty similar to us, whereas the F-14 was a bit different. Now, I'm not sure I would have liked to have lived on the carrier. I have visited one once, and it was fantastic. But
did you really?
Yeah, I got to have a visit on the Abraham Lincoln and a tour around when it was in port once. It was fantastic. They had F-14s there and F-18s, and it was. We got to sit in the captain's seat. And fantastic tour, but when you see how everybody has to live for long periods, it's probably not my cup of tea. And I really take my hats off to all the guys who can land on the carrier, because it's really not that long when you look at it.
Exactly. And, yeah.
I mean, the launch would be fantastic.
Oh yeah, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it?
Landings. Pretty difficult for an Air Force puke who likes a 10,000 foot long runway.
Exactly, yeah.
But the Tomcat would be fantastic to fly, because similar sort of initially, the same engines. So I think we had a better success with the TF30s on the F111, just maybe the way the intakes were generally being low level. And, I basically hardly had a problem with them at all. Didn't pull as much G, but we did a fair bit. And so we're always pulling 4G, sometimes, up to around about 5.5. I think later after I left, they were going to the aircraft limits, which was around 6.5, depending on your weight.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
The Tomcat could pull a bit more. We had to sweep the wings manually, whereas they've got the auto function. So that was a little bit more work. And side by side versus a tandem seat, the tandem seat's definitely so much better for visibility. But, there are some advantages to side-by-side, and, it was built around the ejection module. So, that was a limitation of that. So, we had to do our best with what we could with the visibility. I mean, so I would love to go on a Tomcat and see how it, have a comparison. I think that would be great. But
absolutely,
you could set me up in a Tornado any time as well, Mike.
Absolutely. And one final question, actually, like I've said this a million times now, but do you ever do you ever chat with F-14 pilots, Rios, and have you ever swapped notes? And obviously it's kind of similar, wing sweep, 2 people, 2 engines. Have you ever swapped notes with them guys?
No, not really, because I never really had much opportunities to work with them. Being, the US Navy was sort of, I didn't do a RIM pack, and the only ones I worked with were some EA6 when they were in Perth. One time we were over on exercise and we were attacking a Marine. I think it was a Marine carrier battle group that was over for an exercise, and we happened to be here, and we were attacking them. And once I took off with an EA6 on my wing, and we got them to jam.
A photo of that.
Jamming. Oh, it was fantastic. Oh, look, Mike, I wish I had a camera lots of times, because I took off, and it was dawn, 15-second trail. He joined up on me, and we're headed went out feet wet, and all I could think of was like Flight of the Intruder, even though it was
Yeah.
But that's what it looked like sitting on my left side.
Oh, that would have been I always think like if people had GoPros now, it'd be amazing, or cameras like we do now. The photos that would come out would be absolutely amazing.
Unfortunately, I really didn't appreciate it when, and it was hard to take cameras with you. I got some, but
really,
I've got some photos. Actually, well, perhaps the one behind me with where am I over here? Up there. That was taken by one of my students with me leading my last 4 ship back from Tyndall. So that's just a fantastic shot he got. And but they were just normal handheld film cameras. I had an SLR for about my last couple of years, not even that really. But it's pretty hard to get really good shots. And video cameras were quite rare. I may have some on VH.
Big, weren't they?
Yeah, and the other thing is they're heavy, and as soon as you start turning and pulling any G, it's very hard to keep them. The best one we had was that lipstick camera that was mounted to generally the NAV's helmet and plugged into the intercom system, and that was because it was attached to your head. You could keep it pretty steady, and it was a 90s GoPro.
Exactly, yeah.
But it had to be fitted by, the, camera specialists. It wasn't something we could
you couldn't just stick it on, yeah.
And, there's so many, I wish I had more, but I'm sure everybody says that pre the current era.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And again, so for our viewers who are flight geeks, and stuff like that, but your helmet behind you, I think it says 6 Squadron. Is that your original visor cover?
It's just my visor cover. Unfortunately, they wouldn't let us keep our helmets. The RAAF were a little bit cheap. We were fitted individually with mouldings, and when we left, I can't remember what happened to mine, but yeah, that's my visor cover from 6 Squadron. When we had the lightweight helmets, when I was first at both 6 Squadron and 1 Squadron, we used to have the rather heavy helmets, which but they didn't have those little covers as far as I remember. And I was able to keep that and a couple of other things, but most of the things we had to return. And I guess when I left, really didn't have the money to go and spend a few $1,000s on a helmet at the time.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Right, Mike, that was a brilliant chat. So what are you currently up to while we wrap up this interview? Like, what are you doing? Can we see you anywhere else? Or, have you got any other podcasts coming up?
Well, I have got one in the can, apparently, for Mav Geeks. They're later in the year, I think after the air show season in the UK. And that's a bit of a chat that they have with various people. And keep an eye out for that, perhaps in July, August, September, maybe. I'm not exactly sure when that's going to come out. But it's really good to talk to you and, reminisce on some of the interesting things I've managed to do. I'm very lucky to have had the opportunity to do it and really appreciate those chances.
Absolutely, Mike. Well, thank you very much for coming back on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And yeah, guys, I'll keep you informed when the next chat's coming out with Mike. But yeah, cheers, mate. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.